In this video, we uncover the chilling stories of America's most feared black women in prison history. Women whose actions shocked families, investigators, and entire communities. They were mothers, lovers, professionals, and neighbors, each driven by motives ranging from jealousy and revenge to delusion and despair. Their crimes defied logic and left trails of heartbreak that still echo through the years. From mothers who turned against their children to friends who betrayed the ones who trusted them most. These are not just stories of murder. They are stories of human breakdown and how darkness can hide behind the face of normalcy. Number 1. Marilyn Kay Edge. On a quiet September weekend in 2013, the staff at a Hampton Inn in Santa Ana, California, made a discovery that stunned the nation. Inside a locked third-floor room lay the bodies of two children, 13-year-old Jalen and 10-year-old Faith Edge. Their mother, 42-year-old Marilyn Kay Edge, was nowhere to be found. To outsiders, Marilyn appeared like any other mother, educated, stable, and loving. Born in 1971, she held a business degree and had worked as a financial analyst. But beneath that image was a woman unraveling under emotional and legal pressure. For years, Marilyn had been locked in a bitter custody battle with her ex-husband, Mark Edge, over their two children. The divorce, finalized in 2007, began a long trail of accusations, court hearings, and emotional turmoil. Their son, Jalen, had autism, and Marilyn often used his condition as a weapon in court. She argued that time with his father disrupted his progress, but judges found no evidence to support her claims. In September 2013, a Georgia judge finally granted full custody to Mark and ordered Marilyn to return the children within days. Instead, she ran. Marilyn drove her kids from Arizona to California under the pretense of a short vacation, Disneyland, beaches, and fun. But prosecutors later said it was part of a premeditated plan. On September 14th, she crashed her car into an electrical box outside a Home Depot, attempting to end her own life with an electrical cord. When police rescued her, she broke down and confessed. Her children were dead inside a nearby hotel room. Investigators discovered that Marilyn had poisoned both Jalen and Faith. The exact method was never publicly revealed, but prosecutors described it as deliberate and calculated. She was charged with 2 counts of murder with special circumstances, multiple victims, and murder by poison, charges that could bring the death penalty. In her first court appearance, Marilyn made headlines for her eerie calmness. When asked if she wanted to delay her arraignment, she said, "Only if you promise me the death penalty." Those words captured the despair and defiance of a mother who had decided that if she couldn't control her children, no one else could have them either. Her ex-husband, Mark Edge, was left devastated. In a public statement, he wrote, "I walk away from the evil deeds of one and carry the grief of 3. The tragedy exposed deep failures in mental health monitoring and the dangers of parental alienation during custody battles. Today, Marilyn Edge remains in custody in California. Her case stands as one of the darkest examples of how rage and obsession can destroy everything, even a mother's love. 2 innocent lives were taken, not in anger, but in a twisted act of control. Behind every custody war, there are wounds that courts cannot see. For Marilyn Edge, those wounds turned fatal, and for her children, the price was everything. Number 2. Debra Denise Brown. In the summer of 1984, a quiet storm of violence swept through the Midwest, one that left 8 people dead and several others kidnapped, assaulted, or left for dead. At the heart of that killing spree was a woman no one expected, Debra Denise Brown. Debra was born in 1962 in Ohio, the 5th of 11 children in a struggling family. From the start, life wasn't easy. She suffered multiple head injuries as a child and was later diagnosed with developmental disabilities. Her IQ tested between 59 and 74, showing limited understanding and judgment. By her early 20s, she had never been in trouble with the law. She was quiet, shy, and deeply dependent on others for guidance. Then she met Alton Coleman, a man whose name would forever be linked to one of America's most disturbing crime sprees. Coleman was a smooth-talking predator with a long criminal record of sexual assault and violence. When Brown met him, she became trapped in his orbit. Psychologists would later describe their relationship as a master-slave dynamic. Together, they began a journey of manipulation, brutality, and chaos across 5 states: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Kentucky. For 2 terrifying months, from May to July 1984, Coleman and Brown moved from town to town, befriending strangers and then turning on them without warning. Their victims range from elderly adults to young children. They often gain trust through kindness, a smile, a story, a promise of help, before attacking. Their crimes followed a pattern: deception, control, and ligature strangulation. Many victims were bound, beaten, and killed in cold blood. One of the most haunting cases was that of 7-year-old Tamika Turks. She and her 9-year-old niece were walking home from a candy store when the couple approached them. They offered kindness at first, then kidnapped the girls. Tamika was later found murdered. Brown's role in the crimes has long been debated. Prosecutors said she was an active participant, not a bystander. Witnesses described her as calm and compliant, sometimes even helping restrain victims. Others saw her as a woman brainwashed and terrified, too emotionally broken to resist Coleman's control. Their killing spree finally ended on July 20, 1984, when police captured them in Evanston, Illinois, just 3 days after Coleman was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list. They had been hiding in an abandoned building, living off stolen food and clothes. When the trial began, the nation watched closely. Both were charged in multiple states, and prosecutors cooperated to ensure they faced the death penalty wherever possible. In Ohio, Deborah Brown was sentenced to death for her role in 2 murders. But years later, in 1991, then-Governor Richard Celeste commuted her sentence to life in prison without parole. He cited her mental impairments, her lack of a violent history before meeting Coleman, and the overwhelming psychological control he held over her. Still, Indiana upheld a separate death sentence for another murder, leaving her fate legally complex. To this day, Debra Denise Brown remains the only woman on Indiana's death row. During her imprisonment, Brown has shown little remorse. In one chilling note to a judge, she wrote, "I killed the expletive and I don't give a damn. I had fun out of it." That statement has haunted everyone who followed her case, a glimpse into a mind torn between submission and brutality. Experts continue to study her case as an example of coercive control, how a vulnerable person can become both victim and perpetrator under the influence of someone more dominant. For families of the victims, it doesn't matter who led or who followed. The pain remains the same. Mothers lost their children, and communities lost their sense of safety. Deborah Brown's story is not just about murder. It's about manipulation and the fragile line between free will and control. Whether she was a monster or a mindless follower, her actions helped create one of the darkest chapters in American true crime. Today, behind the prison walls of the Ohio Reformatory for Women, she remains a figure of contradiction, a woman who once seemed too broken to harm anyone, yet left a trail of horror across the Midwest. Her story reminds us that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it obeys. Number 3. Tiffany Hall. In the fall of 2006, a quiet community in East St. Louis, Illinois, was shaken by a crime so brutal that even seasoned detectives struggled to describe it. At the center of it all was a 24-year-old woman named Tiffany Hall, someone trusted, familiar, and often seen as part of the family she would later destroy. Tiffany was born in 1982 and grew up in East St. Louis, a place where poverty and crime were part of the background, but friendship still meant everything. She had known Jamila Tunstall since childhood. The two women attended the same schools, watched each other's kids, and shared secrets. Jamila, at 23, was 7 months pregnant and the mother of 3 small children, ages 7, 2, and 1. Tiffany often babysat them. Nobody imagined she could become their killer. On September 15, 2006, Tiffany Hall arrived at Jamila's apartment, carrying jealousy and frustration she'd been hiding for weeks. Investigators later said she wanted to fake her own pregnancy to hold on to a boyfriend and saw Jamila's unborn child as her opportunity. What happened next was as calculated as it was monstrous. Tiffany attacked Jamila, beating her repeatedly on the head until she lost consciousness. Then, in an act that horrified the nation, she cut the baby from Jamila's womb while the young mother was still alive. Jamila bled to death in the bathtub. Tiffany hid her body in a nearby field. Hours later, Tiffany appeared at a local park carrying a small, lifeless fetus. She told people she had just given birth to a stillborn child. When questioned at the hospital, she refused examination. Her story didn't add up, but no one yet realized the full truth. 3 days later, Tiffany went to see Louis Gully, the father of Jamila's children. Calm and confident, she told him Jamila had asked her to pick up the kids and bring them to her. Trusting her, Gully handed them over. It was the last time he saw them alive. Back at Jamella's apartment, the horror continued. In the same bathtub where their mother had died, Tiffany drowned all three children: 7-year-old Demon, 2-year-old Ivan, and 1-year-old Janelle. She hid their small bodies in the washer and dryer to delay discovery. A week passed before the truth surfaced. During the funeral for the fetus, which Tiffany had named and buried as her own, she broke down and confessed to her boyfriend. She admitted she wasn't pregnant, that she had taken the baby, and that she had killed a woman. He immediately called the police. When officers arrested Tiffany Hall, they found her calm but detached. She confessed in detail, describing each murder without emotion. Investigators said she seemed almost mechanical, a woman whose sense of right and wrong had completely collapsed. Her IQ was later measured in the mid-70s, suggesting mild intellectual disability, but psychologists agreed she knew exactly what she was doing. Facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Tiffany eventually pleaded guilty to all charges: 5 murders, 4 victims, and the unborn child. In June 2008, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In court, relatives of the victims wept silently. Jamella's mother, Sandra Myers, summed up what few could express. "I have to forgive her," she said softly. "Taking one life won't bring the others back." Even hardened detectives said they had never seen anything so cruel, not because it was impulsive, but because it was personal. A betrayal between friends, a violation of trust at the most intimate level. Today, Tiffany Hall remains behind bars in Illinois, spending the rest of her life in a cell. Her crime still stands as one of the most disturbing in the state's history, a case that forced people to question how far jealousy, desperation, and mental instability can push someone. The murders of Jamella Tunstall and her children weren't the result of rage in the moment. They were the result of a planned lie that spiraled into horror. Tiffany Hall wanted to play mother, but instead, she destroyed a family. And in the silence that followed, East St. Louis was left haunted by a truth too terrible to forget. Sometimes, the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers, but from the ones we trust the most. Number 4. Lashaun Ternice Harris. On a calm October evening in 2005, people walking near San Francisco's waterfront witnessed something that would haunt them forever. A young mother from Oakland, Lashaun Ternice Harris, calmly stood by the edge of Pier 7, undressing her 3 small sons. Moments later, she lifted them one by one and dropped them into the dark, cold water of the San Francisco Bay. Lashaun was only 23 years old, a former certified nursing assistant, soft-spoken, and deeply troubled. Behind her quiet demeanor was a long battle with paranoid schizophrenia and mental illness. She had been hospitalized multiple times and had a documented history of delusions, hearing voices, seeing visions, and believing she was communicating with God. Born and raised in Oakland, Harris had shown signs of instability for years. Friends and family described her as loving but unpredictable. She often talked about religious missions and divine instructions. Despite this, she continued to live independently and cared for her 3 sons: 6-year-old Trayshawn, 2-year-old Taranta, and 16-month-old Joshua. But by October 2005, her mental health had taken a devastating turn. She told relatives that God had chosen her for a higher purpose and that evil spirits surrounded her children. On October 19th, she boarded a BART train from Oakland to San Francisco, pushing a stroller and holding her boys' hands. She told a friend she was taking them on a trip to the ocean. When she reached the pier, witnesses noticed her speaking softly to herself while taking off her children's clothes. Some thought she was changing them. But then, in a horrifying sequence, she lifted her sons over the rail and dropped them one by one into the bay. When police found her minutes later pushing an empty stroller, she was calm and detached. She told the officers, "They're with their father now," referring not to her children's biological father, but to God. The search began immediately, but only the body of 2-year-old Taranta was ever recovered. The other 2 boys vanished beneath the waves. Investigators soon learned how many chances there had been to prevent the tragedy. Lashaun's family had repeatedly begged for help, warning that she was hearing voices and talking about sacrificing her children. Her mother even contacted social services on the day of the killings, but no one intervened in time. During questioning, Lashaun spoke openly about her visions. She said God told her to send her sons to heaven where they would be safe. In her mind, she wasn't killing them. She was saving them. Her trial began in 2007 and quickly became one of California's most heartbreaking legal battles. The prosecution argued that Harris knew what she was doing and should face life in prison. The defense presented overwhelming evidence of psychosis and severe schizophrenia, showing years of medical records and psychiatric reports. The jury initially found her guilty of 3 counts of second-degree murder, but just one day later, the judge overturned that verdict, declaring her legally insane. The court ruled that Harris was incapable of understanding the nature or wrongfulness of her actions. Instead of a prison sentence, she was committed to a state mental hospital, where she remains to this day. Her confinement is indefinite, effectively a life sentence under psychiatric care. Experts called her case a tragic example of the thin line between criminal intent and mental illness. Prosecutors admitted they were frustrated, but agreed that true justice required compassion. One psychiatrist later testified that Harris believed her children were in heaven, happy and alive, and that she would one day join them. She even asked him to deliver a letter to God by plane. The story of Lashaun Ternice Harris isn't one of pure evil. It's one of mental collapse in a system that failed to act. Her children didn't die because of hatred, but because their mother's mind had turned against her. 3 small boys, bright, innocent, and full of life, lost their futures because the warnings were ignored. Their story became a symbol of what happens when cries for help go unheard. Today, in the quiet halls of a California state hospital, Lashaun Harris lives in a world still shaped by her delusions. To her, she didn't kill her children. She sent them home. But to everyone else, it was a tragedy beyond words, a chilling reminder that untreated mental illness can turn love into horror. Number 5. Malaika Tamu Griffin. In the spring of 1999, a peaceful street in Denver, Colorado, became the scene of a shocking murder, one that began with a simple argument and ended in a nationwide manhunt. The killer wasn't a hardened criminal or gang member. She was an educated young woman named Malaika Tamu Griffin, a quiet neighbor who hid deep anger behind a calm face. Malaika was born on May 11, 1971, and grew up in Mississippi. She graduated from Jackson State University with a degree in chemistry, smart, independent, and ambitious. She had traveled abroad, lived in different cities, and was known to keep to herself. When she moved to Denver in 1999, she rented a room in a modest house and mostly stayed indoors, rarely socializing. To her neighbors, she was polite but distant. Next door lived Jason Horsley, a 25-year-old carpenter known for his easygoing nature. He lived with his girlfriend, and every evening, Jason would park his truck outside, unloading his tools before heading in. It was a normal, harmless routine, but for reasons no one could explain, it seemed to bother Malaika deeply. On May 18, 1999, a small argument changed everything. Malaika accused Jason of leaving his tools on the sidewalk. He told her he'd move them soon. Words were exchanged, tempers rose, and Jason turned to walk away. But Malaika's anger exploded. She went back into her apartment, grabbed a 9mm handgun equipped with a laser sight, and came back outside. Without another word, she shot Jason in the back. He collapsed instantly and died on the spot. Instead of calling for help, Malaika fled. She carjacked a woman at gunpoint, took her vehicle, and disappeared. Days later, the stolen car was found abandoned in Iowa, but Malaika was gone. When police searched her apartment, they were stunned. Inside, they found an assault rifle, grenades, and manuals on bomb making and terrorism. Her journals were filled with dark, racist, and paranoid writings. She had written about hatred, violence, and preparation for what she called a coming race war. Detectives realized they weren't dealing with a random shooting. It was a premeditated act of hatred and obsession. The discovery turned a neighborhood killing into a national manhunt. Malaika Griffin was profiled on America's Most Wanted several times, but for 6 long years, she managed to vanish completely. Authorities believed she had left the country until 2005, when a rerun of the show finally led to a tip. She was living quietly in El Cajon, California, under the name Lake Griffin. She had gotten a job at a biotech company and sometimes worked in fast food restaurants to blend in. Her co-workers described her as quiet, polite, and mysterious, never talking much about her past. But when the FBI confronted her, she didn't resist. She simply admitted, "I'm Malaika." After 6 years on the run, she was extradited to Colorado to face trial. In court, prosecutors painted a picture of a woman consumed by rage and ideology. They said the murder wasn't just about a sidewalk argument. It was about deep-seated hatred and paranoia that had been building for years. Her writings showed violent fantasies and plans to harm others. Malaika's defense team tried to argue that the shooting was self-defense, that she feared Jason and acted impulsively. She even claimed the journals were fictional scripts for a play she was writing. But the jury didn't believe her. The evidence was overwhelming: the diary, the weapons, and her flight after the murder. In March 2006, Malaika Tamu Griffin was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, she is serving her sentence at La Vista Correctional Facility in Pueblo, Colorado. She has never shown remorse and rarely speaks publicly about the crime. Her story remains one of the most chilling examples of how personal anger and ideology can turn deadly. She was intelligent, educated, and capable of a good life. But instead, she allowed her rage to control her. In the end, Jason Horsley's only mistake was living next door to the wrong person. His death reminds us that danger doesn't always come from strangers or criminals. Sometimes it lives quietly next door, waiting for a spark. Number 6. Marie Dean Arrington. In 1969, the name Marie Dean Arrington struck fear across Florida. She wasn't a professional criminal or a mob boss. She was a mother whose rage pushed her past every limit. Her story is one of revenge, escape, and the dangerous cost of unchecked fury. Marie was born on August 8, 1933, in Florida. Her early life was shaped by instability, violence, and a constant struggle to survive. She wasn't known for crime in her youth, but for a quick temper and a deep resentment toward authority. By her 30s, that anger would explode into one of the most shocking revenge stories in Florida history. It began in 1964, when Marie was charged with killing her husband during a domestic dispute. She claimed it was self-defense, but a jury convicted her of manslaughter and sentenced her to 20 years in prison. While waiting for her appeal, Marie remained free, and that's when her anger found a new target. 2 of her children had been convicted of serious crimes and sentenced to prison. Marie blamed one man for their punishment: Bob Pierce, the public defender assigned to their cases. She became obsessed with the idea that he was responsible for ruining her family's lives. When she couldn't reach him directly, she turned her fury towards someone close to him: his secretary, 37-year-old Vivian Ritter. On April 22, 1968, witnesses saw Marie enter the public defender's office and later drive off with Vivian in her car. Hours later, people in a nearby orange grove heard gunshots echo through the fields. 5 days after that, Vivian's body was found, shot and dumped in a remote area. Investigators didn't take long to connect the dots. A .22 caliber revolver linked to the murder had been borrowed by Marie weeks earlier. In her home, police found Vivian's personal belongings and a chilling handwritten note threatening that someone would die unless certain inmates, including her sons, were released. The handwriting matched Marie's. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. In 1968, the court found her guilty and sentenced her to death. It seemed her violent story had come to an end. But Marie wasn't done. While awaiting execution at the Florida Correctional Institution, she did something almost unthinkable. In 1969, she escaped from prison. Wearing only her pajamas, she cut through a screened window in her cell, climbed the fence, and vanished into the night. Her escape set off a massive nationwide manhunt. Newspapers called her the Lady Killer on the Run, and within months, she became only the second woman ever added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. For nearly 3 years, she evaded capture, changing her name and moving from state to state. In 1971, authorities finally caught her in New Orleans, living quietly under an alias. She was arrested without resistance and returned to Florida to face additional charges for her escape. For that, she received an extra 10 years in prison. Then, in 1972, her life took another turn when the Florida Supreme Court struck down the state's death penalty law. Her death sentence was commuted to life in prison, sparing her from execution. Over the years, Marie became a ghost of Florida's prison system, a legend among inmates, a reminder of how rage can destroy everything. She never denied killing Vivian Ritter, but insisted it was a mistake made in anger. To the victim's family, it was cold-blooded revenge. Even in prison, Marie remained defiant. Guards described her as sharp, fearless, and unrepentant. She served decades behind bars, outliving many of the officers and judges who once handled her case. Marie Dean Arrington died in 2014 after spending more than 40 years in prison. She was in her 80s, a lifetime prisoner who had once escaped death, both literally and legally. Her story remains one of Florida's most infamous, not just because of the violence, but because of the emotion behind it. Marie wasn't driven by greed or insanity. She was driven by vengeance, the kind that blinds reason and turns grief into destruction. In the end, her fury took everything: her freedom, her family, and another innocent life. She once said from prison, "I didn't plan it. I just couldn't stop myself." The name Marie Dean Arrington may have faded from headlines, but her story lives on as a chilling warning that when rage becomes purpose, even a mother can become a killer. Number 7. Lolita Barthel. In 1975, the streets of New Orleans saw a crime that would change the life of a 17-year-old girl forever. Her name was Lolita Barthel, a teenager caught between youth and desperation. A girl who dreamed of money and independence, but ended up trapped in one of the most shocking crimes led by a minor in Louisiana's history. Lolita grew up in poverty. She was a young black girl raised in one of the toughest neighborhoods of New Orleans, surrounded by crime, drugs, and broken homes. Her childhood was filled with chaos: an absent father, a struggling mother, and little guidance. School never held her attention. By 16, she had dropped out and started running with older boys who lived fast and dangerous. One of them was Ronald "Ronnie" Hicks, a 20-year-old petty criminal who saw in Lolita not just a girlfriend, but a partner in crime. He flattered her, promised her a better life, and filled her head with talk of money and power. To a teenager craving attention and security, he seemed exciting, a ticket out of struggle. But what began as small-time mischief soon turned dark. In September 1975, Ronnie and two of his friends planned what they thought would be an easy robbery. Their target, a local taxi driver named Joseph Bro, who was known to carry cash on his late-night shifts. Lolita, young and eager to impress, agreed to help lure the victim. She was the bait, the innocent-looking girl who would flag the cab and make everything seem normal. That night, just after midnight, Lolita waved down Bro's cab. She smiled, climbed into the front seat, and gave an address in the 9th Ward, an area the driver knew well. When they reached a dark street corner, she asked him to stop. That's when Ronnie and the others appeared from the shadows. Within seconds, the plan fell apart. The robbery turned violent. Bro tried to fight back, and one of the men, possibly Ronnie himself, pulled a gun and shot the driver in the head. The men panicked, dragging Lolita into the getaway car as the cab rolled into a pole. The next morning, police found Bro's body slumped over the wheel. The crime shocked the city, a senseless killing for a few dollars. Witnesses had seen a young black girl getting into his cab, and soon the search began. It didn't take long. Lolita was arrested within 48 hours. At first, she denied everything, but as detectives pressed, her story began to unravel. She admitted to being there but blamed Ronnie for the shooting. She said she thought it was just supposed to be a robbery, not murder. Still, under Louisiana law, her involvement made her equally guilty. Prosecutors charged her with first-degree murder, despite her age. During the trial, her youth and vulnerability were front and center. The defense described her as a scared teenager manipulated by older men, someone too naive to understand the consequences. But the jury saw it differently. They saw a girl who helped plan a robbery that ended in death. In 1976, Lolita Barthel was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, at just 17 years old. Her sentence drew national attention. Some argued it was too harsh, pointing out her age and lack of a prior record. Others said it sent a message that even young offenders must face consequences when innocent lives are taken. Over the years, Lolita grew into adulthood behind bars. She earned her GED, found religion, and became known as a quiet, disciplined inmate. Several reform groups later petitioned for her release, arguing that teenage offenders like her deserved a second chance under evolving juvenile sentencing laws. But her case remained locked in the system, a symbol of how fast one bad decision can destroy a life. Today, Lolita remains imprisoned in Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, one of the state's oldest female facilities. She is now in her 60s, a grandmother by age, though she's never lived that life. The story of Lolita Barthel isn't one of pure evil. It's one of misguided youth, manipulation, and irreversible consequences. She was a teenager desperate to belong, and she followed the wrong people into a crime that took a man's life and her freedom forever. Her name may not be widely known, but her story carries a simple, tragic truth. One reckless night can erase everything: dreams, youth, and the chance to start again. Number 8. Lutrische Dancy. In 2007, the small Mississippi town of Greenwood woke up to a tragedy that seemed impossible to understand. Inside a modest home, police discovered the lifeless bodies of Lutrische Dancy's mother and her two young daughters, a scene so violent that even veteran officers were shaken. The killer wasn't a stranger or an intruder. It was Lutrische herself, a 29-year-old woman who had turned her anger and despair inward until it destroyed the very people she loved most. Lutrische Dancy had grown up in Greenwood, raised in a hard-working church-going family. Neighbors described her as polite, smart, and quiet. But behind that calm face was a storm that had been building for years. She battled mental illness, depression, and family tension, and her relationships were often volatile. By her late 20s, she was unemployed, isolated, and moving back and forth between relatives' homes. Her mother, Mary Dancy, was her anchor, patient but firm. She tried to help her daughter get back on her feet, often caring for Lutrische's two girls, 5-year-old Latoya and 3-year-old Jasmine. But constant arguments over money, parenting, and discipline made the home tense. In early May 2007, Lutrische's life began to spiral again. She had recently separated from the children's father and felt trapped, broke, hopeless, and angry. Her mother urged her to seek counseling, but instead, Lutrische's resentment deepened. She felt everyone was against her family, her community, and even God. On the night of May 9, 2007, police believe Lutrische reached her breaking point. She argued with her mother over finances and custody. Neighbors heard shouting but assumed it was a normal family fight. Sometime later, Lutrische grabbed a kitchen knife and attacked Mary as she sat in the living room. When the struggle ended, her mother lay bleeding on the floor. Then, in what investigators later called an act of twisted mercy, Lutrische turned on her daughters. She carried them one by one into the bedroom, smothered them with a pillow, and laid them side by side on the bed. Detectives said the room looked eerily calm, as if she had tucked them in for sleep. After the murders, Lutrische wrote a short note saying she wanted peace and that they would all be together. She then tried to take her own life by cutting her wrists, but failed. The next morning, she called 911 and confessed, "I hurt them. Please send someone." When officers arrived, she was covered in blood but quiet, almost numb. She didn't resist arrest. In her first statement, she said she couldn't handle life anymore, that voices in her head told her she and her children would be better off dead. The crime stunned Greenwood. Reporters described it as one of the worst domestic killings in Lafleur County history. During her trial, prosecutors argued it was murder out of rage, not insanity, that she lashed out at her mother and then killed her children to avoid punishment. The defense, however, presented extensive evidence of mental illness and severe depression, supported by psychiatric evaluations and family testimony. After weeks of hearings, the judge accepted a plea of guilty but mentally ill. Lutrische Dancy was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison, with no possibility of parole. She was sent to the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility, where she remains to this day. Prison staff describe her as quiet, withdrawn, and heavily medicated. She rarely speaks about her crime, though she told a counselor that she dreams of her daughters often and prays for forgiveness. The Dancy murders left a community scarred, not only by the loss of 3 innocent lives, but by the reminder of how untreated mental illness and hopelessness can destroy families. Her relatives, still grieving, have said they forgive her, but can never forget what happened. In the end, Lutrische Dancy's story isn't about evil or greed. It's about a woman who broke under the weight of pain, isolation, and untreated mental illness. She killed the people who loved her most, believing somehow she was saving them. Today, the small house in Greenwood is gone, but the story remains a haunting reminder that behind some of the worst crimes are people who needed help long before tragedy struck.